The desert night carried a bitter wind that smelled of scorched sagebrush and fear. Under its cloak, a desperate crime unfolded that would change lives before the first hint of dawn. Eliza Morgan was bound hand and foot inside a wooden wagon, the ropes biting into her wrists and ankles. Her copper hair, now partially hidden under a dirt-streaked scarf, clung to her sweaty face. Her green eyes, sharp and defiant, scanned the shadows outside the wagon as the wheels creaked over the rough desert sand. She had been traveling alone for weeks, a wandering trader bringing medicines and supplies to scattered settlements. But this trip, this night, had gone horribly wrong. The men outside whispered and cursed, their accents rough, voices carrying the unmistakable edge of desperation. Cutter Lane, the leader, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar running down his left cheek. His reputation was legendary, ruthless, cunning, and utterly without mercy. Cutter believed he had captured a young Apache woman who knew the location of a hidden gold mine, a prize that could make him rich beyond imagination. But in the cruel lottery of fate, he had chosen the wrong person. Eliza? A voice barked. Cutter's tone cut through the cold night. "Are you awake back there?" Eliza didn't respond. A soft cough would have betrayed herself, and that wasn't an option. She had to buy time, to figure out her next move before the morning sun revealed all their mistakes. She strained against the ropes, feeling the fibers dig into her skin, but she had learned patience from long hours tending soldiers' wounds during the war. Desperation sharpened her mind. Every creak of the wagon, every whisper of the men outside, every gust of the desert wind became a vital clue. The wagon itself told her stories. The uneven wheels suggested they had been in a hurry, the splintered sideboards hinted at careless repair, and the faint smell of sweat and horses indicated exhaustion. All these little details might be the difference between life and death. Cutter Lane's gang argued among themselves, giving her a small advantage. "We should have taken the southern route," one muttered, kicking at the wagon wheel. "No," Cutter growled. "We're not risking another patrol. The northern pass is clear, and by sunrise we'll have the gold and the girl." Eliza's pulse quickened. "The girl?" She muttered to herself under her gag. They didn't know the truth yet. They had kidnapped the wrong person. From a distant ridge, another figure observed the unfolding chaos with lethal precision. Silas Blackthorn Hayes, a gunslinger whose name carried more fear than any lawman in the territory, had been tracking Cutter Lane for months. Stories of his exploits were whispered in every saloon and cattle town. He never missed, never hesitated, and never left a foe alive unless he chose mercy. Silas had long black hair that caught the moonlight, a bare, muscular chest marked by old scars, and tribal jewelry clinking faintly as he crouched behind a boulder. His eyes were as sharp as a hawk's, trained on the wagon and its occupants. He had known immediately that something was wrong when he spotted Cutter Lane's gang leaving the settlement hours earlier. Something in the movement, in the hurried whispers, suggested a kidnapping, but the way Cutter's men had argued over direction confirmed that they were uncertain. Dangerous and vulnerable the night dragged on, the darkness becoming almost tangible, pressing against Eliza's skin like the ropes that bound her. Her mind raced, cataloging every option, every potential flaw in their plan. She noticed the knots on her wrists were uneven, hastily tied. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She gnawed at the ropes with her teeth, careful not to make a sound that could alert Cutter Lane. Each tug brought the rough fibers closer to giving way. Meanwhile, Silas shifted slightly, his movements measured, fluid. Every muscle in his body worked in unison, every motion calculated for maximum efficiency. He knew the first shot would set the tone for the entire encounter. If Cutter Lane realized they were being watched too early, the outlaws might scatter, dragging Eliza into a more precarious position. Patience was everything. He waited. The first hint of dawn tinted the horizon in violent streaks of red and orange, painting the desert in an eerie glow. Cutter Lane, oblivious to the danger creeping toward him, was giving orders in frustration. "Keep moving," he shouted. "We'll be rich by sunrise, I swear it." Eliza felt her stomach knot with tension, but also with a small spark of hope. That voice rising over the wind reminded her of tales told in whispers about a man who never failed, a shadow in the night who struck terror into the hearts of criminals. Could it be him? Could Silas Blackthorn have found her? Her chance came when Cutter's men, in their haste, began to argue near the wagon. One of them kicked a rock that clattered loudly against the side. Eliza seized the moment, pulling with every ounce of strength she had left. The rough fibers of the rope had worn thin, and with a sudden, sharp tug, one of the knots gave way. Her hands were free, though her legs remained bound. Silas chose that moment to act. Moving like a panther, he leapt from his hiding place atop the ridge, landing silently behind a boulder near the wagon. His twin revolvers gleamed faintly in the morning light. Cutter Lane's men froze, startled by the sudden appearance of the legendary gunslinger. "Drop your guns," Silas said, his voice low, smooth, but carrying an unmistakable edge of danger. "Now." Eliza, heart pounding in her chest, felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly made her dizzy. The nightmare of being in the wrong place at the wrong time had finally intersected with the myth she had heard whispered in saloons, campfires, and trading posts. Cutter Lane's hand twitched toward his revolver, but Silas was faster. In one fluid motion, he had the weapon spinning out of the outlaw's grip and out of reach. Two of the men scrambled for cover, while another tried to pull a knife. Silas dispatched him with a single shot. Precise and silent. Eliza took the opportunity to slip out of the wagon, the coarse wood scraping her back as she moved. The desert wind, sharp and dry, stung her face and carried the scent of horses and gunpowder. She rolled to the side, hiding behind a boulder as Silas moved with lethal efficiency, ensuring the remaining outlaws were incapacitated without harming her. Cutter Lane finally realized the truth too late. "Wait, she's not the girl," he shouted, his voice cracking in panic and fury. But his words were lost to the desert wind and the sound of gunfire. Eliza's mind raced. She had to escape fully, but first she had to assess the situation. Silas approached her cautiously, twin revolvers lowered but ready. His piercing eyes studied her for a moment before recognition softened his expression slightly. "You're not who they were looking for," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "But that doesn't mean you're safe yet." "I know," Eliza replied, catching her breath. Her voice, though shaky, carried the steel of determination. "But thanks to you, I have a chance." Silas nodded once, his gaze sweeping the desert horizon. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying the promise of danger, but also the possibility of justice. By sunrise, a legendary gunslinger had reached the fence, and a mistaken kidnapping had begun to unravel in ways no one, including Cutter Lane, could have anticipated. Eliza untied her ankles and took her first steps into freedom, wincing as the ropes had bruised her skin. The desert stretched endlessly before her, beautiful, harsh, and unforgiving. Every grain of sand, every jagged rock seemed alive with possibility, danger, and the promise of survival. Silas gestured toward a narrow canyon that would provide cover and a route for escape. "This way," he said. "We need to move before more of his men show up." Eliza followed, every nerve on edge, but a flicker of hope warming her chest. Mistakes had been made, but she was determined to survive them, to take back control of her life. The desert might be vast and ruthless, but it had never known a woman willing to fight, and tonight. She wasn't alone. By the time the first rays of sunlight struck the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand and sagebrush, Eliza and Silas had vanished into the canyon. Cutter Lane's men lay defeated or unconscious, a testament to the precision and power of a gunslinger who had chosen the right moment to strike. The story of Eliza Morgan and the wrong Apache woman had begun not with gold, not with treasure, but with courage, quick thinking, and the sudden appearance of a man whose legend had been whispered for decades. And in the quiet desert dawn, as the wind shifted and the world slowly came to life, one truth was already clear. No one who had crossed paths with Silas Blackthorn or survived the night would ever forget the name. The desert had claimed many lives, but tonight it had gifted survival, and the first act of an epic struggle had come to an end. Yet for Eliza Morgan, it was only the beginning. The desert sun had begun its slow, merciless climb above the horizon, casting a harsh light over the jagged rocks and dry sagebrush. The warmth should have been comforting, but for Eliza Morgan, it was only another layer of discomfort pressing against her skin as she followed Silas through the narrow canyon. Her muscles ached from the ropes that had bound her, from the hurried escape, from the adrenaline that refused to leave her system. Every movement had to be careful. A single misstep could send them tumbling down the cliffside or alert Cutter Lane's remaining men. Silas moved ahead, his long black hair catching the light as he went, the tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists glinting with each calculated step. His chest, bare except for scars and sun-darkened skin, flexed with each motion. There was a rhythm to his movements, almost hypnotic, and Eliza found herself unconsciously matching it as they navigated the rocky terrain. She had never seen a man so at home in the desert, so untouchable in his awareness of danger. Behind them, the faint echoes of movement told a story they could not ignore. Cutter Lane had not given up, not yet. He was an opportunist, and desperate men were always the most dangerous kind. Eliza could hear their footsteps on the loose gravel, the occasional muttered curse, the jangle of a belt or spur. The outlaws were hunting her, and Silas had made it clear. There would be no second chances if they caught her. Eliza kept her breathing steady, focusing on the sound of the wind, the rustle of rocks shifting beneath their feet, and the distant calls of desert birds. Her mind was working frantically, cataloging escape routes, noting potential hazards, memorizing the terrain in case she had to outrun them alone. Every small detail counted, the way a boulder leaned, the sharp drop of a cliff, the color of sand that marked a narrow, hidden path. Cutter Lane was closing in. Eliza could sense it before she even saw them. The desert seemed to shift as they approached, a subtle disturbance in the otherwise silent expanse. And then the first shout rang out, sharp and frantic, cutting across the canyon like a knife. "There, over the rocks. Don't let them escape." Silas signaled her to duck behind a large, jagged boulder. She pressed herself flat against the sun-warmed stone, feeling its heat through the fabric of her clothes. The wind carried the scent of sweat, dust, and fear from the outlaws, and her stomach churned at the reminder of how close they still were. Silas, however, remained calm, almost detached, as though the desert itself obeyed his command. The first man emerged into view, reckless and panicked, scanning the terrain for a glimpse of her. Silas didn't hesitate. A single shot rang out, sharp and precise, and the man dropped to the ground, his scream cut short. Eliza felt a shiver run down her spine. This was survival, raw and unflinching. She had seen men die before, but never like this, never so suddenly, never so clearly. Another man appeared, and Silas fired again, then another. In a matter of minutes, the canyon was littered with the fallen dust rising in slow clouds around them. Cutter Lane's voice finally rose in panic, sharp and desperate. "Stop him, stop them. She's not who we thought." Eliza seized the opportunity. Her ankles had been freed, and though her wrists were still slightly sore from earlier, she moved swiftly, silently, darting between boulders with Silas close behind. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. She had to stay alive, not just for herself, but for the truth. She could not allow Cutter Lane's greed to destroy innocent lives over a mistaken identity. Hours passed as they moved through the labyrinthine canyon. The heat was unrelenting, pressing down on them, forcing sweat from every pore. Silas showed her hidden paths, crevices between rocks that offered concealment, narrow ledges along cliffs that tested her balance and courage. Eliza's legs ached and her chest burned from exertion, but she kept pace. Every time she faltered, she reminded herself that Cutter Lane's men were ruthless and capable, and that hesitation could mean death. By late afternoon, they reached an abandoned settlement, a ghost town half swallowed by sand and time. Rusted signs swung in the wind, their paint flaking and faded, and broken windows gaped like dark eyes. This was where Silas slowed, allowing Eliza to rest. Though their respite was brief, crouching behind a collapsed wooden wall, she finally dared to look at Silas. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was a subtle intensity to them that suggested he understood her fear and her resilience. "We can't stay here long," he said, voice low but firm. "They're still out there, and if Cutter Lane catches even a glimpse of us, it won't end well." Eliza nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "I know, but we need a plan, and we need supplies. I can't keep running without some kind of strategy." Silas gave a faint nod. "Then we improvise. There's a water source behind that building," he said, pointing to a half-buried structure that had once been a general store. "We fill canteens, move at dusk. Nightfall favors us, it hides movement, masks sound, and lets the desert do what it does best." They approached cautiously, eyes alert to the possibility of ambush. Eliza's pulse thumped against her ribs as she crouched beside Silas, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted a rusted lid off a wooden crate. Inside, she found dusty cans of beans, dried meat, and a few bottles of water. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them moving. Silas moved silently to a broken doorway, peering out. "They're following the wrong trail. Cutter Lane thinks you're someone else. That's our advantage." Eliza swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "I can't believe this is happening," she said. "Mistaken identity, a legendary gunslinger. It feels unreal." Silas didn't respond, but the faint smirk on his lips suggested he had heard such disbelief before. He simply motioned for her to follow, and they slipped into the shadows, moving along the edge of the ghost town. The heat of the day began to fade, replaced by the creeping chill of early evening. The sun dipped lower, streaking the sky with violent reds and oranges, turning the desert into a fiery canvas. Cutter Lane's shouts grew more distant but no less frantic. Eliza realized that he wasn't just hunting her. He was unraveling, panic setting in as he understood that his greed had led him into a trap he hadn't seen coming. As they climbed a rocky, inclined toward a narrow canyon path, Silas finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight we strike back. Cutter Lane underestimates you. Underestimates me. That's how we survive." Eliza nodded, swallowing the lump of fear in her throat. "I'll do whatever it takes." By the time they reached a small outcropping that overlooked the desert plain, the first stars were appearing, silver pinpricks in the darkening sky. From here, they could see Cutter Lane's campfires in the distance, scattered and chaotic. Silas studied the layout, eyes narrowing. "4 men left," he murmured. "We can take them. Quietly. Precisely. You stay behind me, and you stay low." Eliza felt a thrill of adrenaline mingled with fear. She had never fired a gun in anger, had never fought to survive in this way, yet there was a strange sense of clarity to the moment. Every movement mattered, every heartbeat counted, and mistakes could not be afforded. The night descended fully, turning the desert into a shadowy labyrinth. Silas moved first, swift and silent, eliminating the nearest sentry with a single shot. Eliza followed, her heart pounding as she mimicked his movements, learning instinctively how to use the terrain for advantage. Rocks, shadows, wind, and dust became their allies. When they reached Cutter Lane's central fire, the outlaw himself was pacing, muttering about gold and revenge, unaware of the approaching storm. Silas's eyes locked on him, calculating every possible move. Eliza's stomach twisted at the tension, but she trusted him completely. The confrontation was close now. Silas raised a hand, signaling her to stay low. "On my mark," he whispered. "We end this tonight." Eliza nodded, heart hammering, palms sweaty. Cutter Lane was about to learn the true meaning of underestimation. The Red Rock Canyon loomed ahead like a scar on the desert, its jagged cliffs casting long shadows in the silver light of the rising moon. Eliza pressed herself against a boulder, feeling the rough surface scrape her palm, her heart pounding so loudly it threatened to give away their position. Silas crouched beside her, his dark eyes scanning the labyrinth of rocks and crevices ahead. The tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists made a faint clinking sound as he shifted, a quiet rhythm that somehow felt like a heartbeat of its own. Cutter Lane had taken refuge somewhere in the canyon, convinced that the labyrinthine rocks would protect him from anyone foolish or brave enough to follow. He paced in a small clearing, muttering to himself about the gold he believed he was entitled to, about the Apache woman who held the key to riches, and about the gunslinger who had to be nothing more than a myth. The faint glow of a campfire reflected off the sweat on his face, making the scar on his cheek look like a black river under the flickering light. Eliza swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "How many do you think are left?" she whispered. "4, maybe 5, Silas replied, his voice low but firm. "And they don't know how fast the desert can kill them. That's our advantage." Eliza's stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They had chased Cutter Lane across miles of desert, through abandoned towns and jagged canyons, and now it had come down to this, a confrontation in the heart of a canyon that had swallowed countless lives before. She had to trust Silas, had to follow his lead, and had to believe that she could survive whatever came next. Silas moved first, slipping silently from the shadows, his bare feet gripping the rocky ground, every muscle in his body tense and controlled. Eliza followed as best she could, using the rocks for cover, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Each step was calculated to avoid the loose gravel and hidden crevices that could betray them. Her hands ached from the earlier bindings, but she didn't dare slow down. Survival demanded focus, and there was no room for hesitation. They reached a narrow ridge, overlooking the clearing where Cutter Lane's small campfire burned. The man was still pacing, unaware of the danger stalking him. Silas motioned for Eliza to stay behind him, and she obeyed instinctively, pressing herself against the warm rock. The canyon walls echoed with the wind and distant animal calls, but the silence between the sounds felt heavier, laden with the threat of sudden violence. Eliza glanced at Silas, noting the way his fingers hovered near his twin revolvers. His long black hair fell in shadows across his face, but she could see the intensity in his eyes, the same intensity she had witnessed when he first appeared at the fence to save her. He was a predator, precise and patient, and she had never felt anything quite like it. A branch snapped somewhere behind Cutter Lane, and the man froze mid-step, eyes scanning the darkness. His hand went to his revolver, but Silas had already anticipated the movement. A single, nearly silent shot rang out, and one of Cutter's men crumpled to the ground, the sound barely disturbing the night. Eliza's stomach clenched, but she forced herself to stay low, letting the gunslinger work while she remained the unseen observer. The other men reacted, yelling and drawing their weapons, but Silas was faster. Each movement was deliberate, each shot controlled. 2 more of Cutter Lane's men went down before they could even understand what had happened. Dust rose from the ground, mingling with the faint smoke from the campfire, and the canyon seemed to close in around them, turning the night into a corridor of tension and threat. Eliza knew they couldn't linger. Silas turned to her, signaling to move, and she followed, her legs trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. They used the rocks as cover, darting from one shadow to another, until they were close enough to the campfire that she could see Cutter Lane clearly. The man's face was twisted with rage and panic now, his plans unraveling faster than he could comprehend. "Where is she?" he shouted, voice raw with frustration. "I know you brought her. The girl, she's mine." Eliza felt a pang of anger. They had mistaken her for someone else, treated her like an object in a game of greed and superstition, and now Cutter Lane's panic was feeding the fire. She wanted to speak, to tell him that he had the wrong woman, but Silas's hand on her shoulder stopped her. One wrong move, and all would be lost. Silas moved closer, staying low, his revolvers gleaming faintly in the firelight. He fired again, dispatching another man who had attempted to flank them. The crack of the gun echoed through the canyon, blending with the panicked shouts of Cutter Lane. Eliza's heart pounded as she realized how close they were to him now. One more step and they could end this nightmare. Cutter Lane drew his revolver, firing wildly into the shadows. Eliza ducked instinctively, feeling the heat of a bullet pass mere inches from her shoulder. Her chest heaved as adrenaline surged, but she focused on Silas, trusting him completely. Every move he made was calculated, every shot measured. There was no room for error, and he knew it. Finally, they were within striking distance. Silas raised his hand, signaling her to stay low, and stepped out from behind the rock. His movements were fluid, precise, and terrifyingly fast. Cutter Lane's eyes widened in recognition of what he was facing, but it was too late. Silas disarmed him with a flick of his wrist, sending the revolver clattering to the ground. "You underestimated me," Silas said, voice low and deadly calm. "And you underestimated her." Eliza moved forward cautiously, keeping her hands visible. Cutter Lane's face twisted in rage and disbelief, but Silas had already neutralized the remaining men. They were either unconscious or too terrified to move. "You," Cutter Lane began, but Silas cut him off with a hard stare. "No one dies tonight, not because of you. But you're finished. Do you understand?" Eliza stepped closer, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her body. "You made a mistake, Cutter Lane. You kidnapped the wrong woman. And now you're going to pay for it." Cutter Lane's shoulders slumped, the fight leaving him as he realized the truth. He had been chasing legends, greed, and shadows, and in doing so, he had overestimated himself. Silas kept his revolvers raised, ensuring the man didn't even think of a desperate move. The night air was thick with tension, and for a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the faint clinking of Silas's jewelry and the distant howl of a desert coyote. Eliza exhaled slowly, feeling a sense of release washing over her. They had survived, and the nightmare was ending. Silas finally lowered his revolvers, but his gaze remained fixed on Cutter Lane. "The authorities will be here soon," he said. "You'll answer for everything you've done." Cutter Lane nodded weakly, defeated, knowing that he had no options left. Eliza could see the fear and resignation in his eyes, and it gave her a small, grim satisfaction. She had been kidnapped, chased across the desert, and put in mortal danger, but she had survived. She had survived with Silas by her side, a man whose presence had been as much a shield as a weapon. The two of them moved away from the campfire. leaving Cutter Lane and his remaining men tied and disarmed, awaiting the sheriff's arrival. The canyon was quiet now, the dust settling, the rocks cold under the moonlight. Eliza's legs ached, her arms were sore, but her spirit felt stronger than it ever had. Silas glanced at her, expression unreadable in the silver light. "You did well," he said, a rare note of approval in his voice. "Most wouldn't have lasted this long." Eliza shook her head, a small, tired smile on her face. "I didn't do it alone," she replied. "You were the one who made it possible." Silas merely nodded, eyes scanning the horizon for any other threats. In the desert, danger never truly disappeared, and he had learned long ago that complacency was deadly. But for now, the immediate threat was gone, and they could breathe. If only briefly, the first hints of dawn began to touch the canyon walls, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson. The desert, harsh and unyielding, had tested them both, but it had also revealed strengths they hadn't known existed. Eliza felt a sense of clarity, of purpose. She had survived the kidnapping, outwitted Cutter Lane, and endured the chase. She had proven that courage and intelligence could triumph over greed and brutality. Silas remained silent, but the faintest corner of his mouth lifted in a shadow of a smile. The desert had shown them both something important. Survival depended not just on skill, but on trust, timing, and knowing when to strike. They descended from the ridge, moving toward the path that would lead them out of the canyon. The wind had softened, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant water. Eliza walked with her head held high, muscles aching but spirit unbroken. The desert had been a harsh teacher, but it had also been a proving ground, and they had both passed the test. Cutter Lane would face justice. Silas would continue his wandering, a shadow in the desert, and Eliza would survive stronger than before, carrying the story of this night with her forever. And as the canyon faded behind them, swallowed once again by shadows and sand, the desert whispered a truth they both understood. Some battles are won not with gold or revenge, but with courage, patience, and the quiet skill of a gunslinger who never misses. The desert dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold, crimson, and violet. The air was still, heavy with the scent of sand, sagebrush, and smoke from distant campfires. Eliza Morgan squinted against the rising sun, feeling the warmth of its first rays on her tired, sweat-streaked face. Her muscles ached from the chase and the fight, but she stood taller now, carrying a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. The events of the last day kidnapping. Pursuit, confrontation felt almost unreal, like a nightmare that had finally ended. Silas Hayes moved beside her, silent and deliberate as always, his long black hair catching the light, his tribal jewelry clinking faintly with each step. The desert had tested them both, but he had never faltered, never hesitated. And his presence had been more than protection. It had been a lesson in survival, precision, and unflinching courage. Eliza had seen the myth in motion, and now she knew it was real. They approached the small ghost town where Cutter Lane and the few surviving outlaws had been captured. The sheriff and his deputies had arrived at first light, horses' hooves stirring up clouds of dust. Cutter Lane, bound and bruised, sat slumped on the ground, scowling at the world as if it had personally betrayed him. His pride, greed, and brutality had all led to this moment, and the sight of lawmen taking control seemed almost too fitting to be coincidence. Eliza stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Cutter Lane. "You made mistakes," she said quietly, her voice carrying both authority and a hard-earned calm. "You kidnapped the wrong person. You threatened lives for nothing. And now, you will answer for it." Cutter Lane's lips curled into a snarl, but he said nothing. His bravado had evaporated under the weight of reality, replaced by a pale, desperate fear. The sheriff nodded to him, gesturing for the deputies to secure him for transport to the nearest town where he would face trial. The man's empire of greed and violence had crumbled, and there was no one left to save him. Eliza turned to Silas, letting a faint smile touch her lips. "It's finally over," she said, though the words felt strange, almost hollow after the intensity of the past 24 hours. Silas studied her for a moment, eyes sharp as a hawk. "It's never completely over," he said, voice low. "The desert keeps score, and there will always be those who think greed and violence will go unpunished. But for now, this is a small victory." The sheriff approached them, a tall man with sun-leathered skin and eyes that had seen too many desperate situations. "I owe you both thanks," he said, glancing at Silas first, then at Eliza. "Cutter Lane is dangerous. You two took incredible risks." Eliza shook her head. "I couldn't have done it alone," she said. "Silas, he saved my life. We survived because of him." The gunslinger merely nodded, quiet and measured, a shadow of a smile appearing at the corners of his mouth. He had spent years in solitude, wandering the desert, and he rarely allowed himself acknowledgement. But for Eliza, he made an exception as the sheriff and his deputies took Cutter Lane away. The two of them began walking toward the edges of the ghost town. The sun climbed higher, the heat beginning to bake the desert once more. Eliza's skin prickled under the light, but she didn't mind. The desert had been harsh, unyielding, and unforgiving. Yet it had also taught her something invaluable. Her strength, her courage, and her ability to endure were far greater than she had ever imagined. Silas walked beside her in silence for a time, his presence a steady anchor against the chaos that had been their lives for the past day. Finally, he spoke. "You did well out there," he said. "Not many could have kept their head in the canyon, surrounded by danger, knowing every step could be the last. You kept your wits, and you survived. That matters." Eliza felt a strange warmth in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and pride. "I only survived because you were there," she said. "I couldn't have done it alone." Silas's dark eyes met hers, piercing but unreadable. "Maybe not. But you followed, you adapted, you endured. That's more than most people can claim. You've earned this." For a moment, they simply walked, the desert stretching endlessly in front of them, the wind whispering over the rocks and sand. The canyon behind them was quiet now, the shadows retreating with the morning light. Eliza felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in years, a rare peace that came not from safety, but from survival, from having faced danger and emerged alive. They reached the edge of the town where the road stretched out toward the distant mountains. Horses waited, tied to posts, their flanks glistening with sweat. Silas approached one of the horses, brushing sand from its mane, and looked back at Eliza. "You'll need to rest before you move on," he said. "Traveling alone now isn't safe, not yet." Eliza nodded, appreciating the concern but also aware of her own independence. "I'll manage," she said. "But I want to help rebuild this town, even if only a little. People need hope after nights like these." Silas's gaze softened slightly. "Then do it," he said. "But remember, the desert isn't kind. It tests everyone eventually." For the next few days, Eliza stayed in the settlement, helping tend wounds, repair structures, and bring order to a place that had seen chaos. The townspeople were wary at first, but word of her bravery and of Silas's intervention spread quickly. They looked to her with respect, and in their eyes, she saw the same reflection of courage she had felt in herself. Silas remained nearby, watching from the shadows, always present but never imposing. Occasionally, he would offer a word of guidance or lend his strength to a task that required muscle or skill, but for the most part, he allowed her to take the lead. There was an unspoken understanding between them. The bond formed in the desert through danger and survival did not need constant acknowledgement. It simply existed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Eliza and Silas stood atop a ridge overlooking the desert. The wind was cool, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant water. Cutter Lane's capture had ensured that no further threat would come from him, and the settlement was slowly recovering. "You saved lives," Eliza said softly, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. "Including mine. I don't know how I could ever repay you." Silas shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "No repayment is needed. The desert has a way of balancing itself. You survived, you learned, and you endured. That is enough." Eliza looked at him, noting the scars, the strength, the quiet intensity in his eyes. There was so much about him that was a mystery, so much untold story, but she felt a rare sense of trust. "I hope our paths cross again," she said. Silas's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened in a way that suggested he felt the same. "Paths cross when they're meant to," he said. "Until then, survive, endure, live." The days passed and life in the settlement slowly returned to a fragile normalcy. Eliza worked tirelessly, her hands blistered, her clothes dusty and torn, but she found a sense of purpose in the routines of rebuilding. She knew the desert would always hold its dangers, but she also knew that she had survived the worst it could throw at her. With Silas by her side, when the day came for Silas to leave, he did so quietly, mounting his horse and disappearing into the horizon. Eliza watched him go, the desert swallowing him once more into its vast, unyielding landscape. She felt a pang of loss, but also a strange sense of gratitude. He had taught her that survival required more than strength, it required courage, patience, and the willingness to face danger head-on. Eliza stayed in the settlement, helping rebuild lives and tending to those in need. Over time, she became a figure of respect and inspiration, a living legend of courage and endurance. The story of the wrong Apache woman and the legendary gunslinger spread far and wide, told in hushed tones around campfires and in saloons. People spoke of Eliza Morgan, a woman who had faced kidnapping, danger, and near death, and lived to tell the tale. They spoke of Silas Hayes, a shadow in the desert, a gunslinger who appeared when least expected and vanished just as silently. And though the desert remained as harsh, unforgiving, and unpredictable as ever, Eliza had found something rare, a sense of purpose, a strength she had never known, and a story that would survive long after the desert winds had swept across the sand. The canyon behind her was quiet now, empty of threats and filled with the memory of survival. The sun rose higher, the heat pressing against the land, but for Eliza, it was no longer a burden. It was a reminder of what she had endured, of what she had overcome, and of the life she could still build in a world that had tested her every step of the way. In the end, Cutter Lane faced justice, the settlement began to heal, and the desert kept its secrets. Eliza continued her work, Silas continued his wandering, and the story of their encounter became legend, a tale of courage, survival, and the quiet, unyielding power of those who refused to surrender. The desert had claimed many, but tonight it had offered redemption, justice, and the promise that bravery could survive even in the harshest, most unforgiving places. And as the wind whispered across the rocks and sand, Eliza knew with certainty that she had not only survived, but had truly lived.